We have just read the Transcendental Aesthetic, in which Kant discussed what sensibility brings a priori to human cognition. And now, in the second part of the Transcendental Doctrine of Elements, we are going to look at reason and the understanding. We are going to look at the other part of human cognition, which, according to Kant, always has to come together with intuition, with, therefore, sensibility, if we are to really cognize anything, if we really are to think about any objects. So this is what Kant writes here in the very beginning of the Transcendental Logic, when he is going to explain to us the idea of a transcendental logic. He writes, "Our cognition arises from two fundamental sources in the mind, the first of which is the reception of representations, the second the faculty for cognizing an object by means of those representations. Through the former an object is given to us, through the latter it is thought in relation to that representation. Intuition and concepts therefore constitute the elements of all our cognition, so that neither concepts without intuition corresponding to them in some way, nor intuition without concepts can yield a cognition." Right, so Kant is not just telling us here that there are sort of two elements of cognition, right? There is on the one hand intuition, when an object is given to us, insensibility, and on the other hand there is concepts, there is the use of concepts through the understanding, through reason, right? When we really conceptualize something and think it in the strong sense of the word think, it's not just that there are these two elements of human cognition, it is also the case that they always have to come together. Unless they come together, we have no real cognition, right? We don't really grasp any object in thought, because in order to grasp an object in thought, we need an object to be given to us in receptivity, right? That is what the intuitions do. And then we need to think it, we need to understand it using our concepts. And so that is what Kant has just been saying, and a little lower he says the same thing, but in the very, very famous phrase, maybe one of the most famous phrases from the entire critique, where he writes the following. He says, "Thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind." So thoughts without content, that is when I'm using my understanding, but no object has been given to me in an intuition. So my thought, my use of concepts, doesn't apply to an object. It has no objective reality. I can do that, right? Thoughts without content, it's pretty easy to have thoughts without content. I can have some right now, right? Ooh, all blurbles are flurk. Well, if all blurbles are fluke, then at least one blurble must be flurk. I mean, that was seemingly those were thoughts. I'm not really sure whether they count as concepts. But I can even reason with that, right? I can talk with that. And maybe it's possible for us, not in this case, but in other cases, to get caught up in these kinds of purely intellectual, linguistic practices where we think we are thinking something, but actually no objects have been given to us. And so actually our thoughts turn out to be empty. In fact, Kant thinks that happens a lot in metaphysics, and he's going to spend an important part of the book talking about that. So thoughts without content are empty. At the same time, intuitions without concepts are blind, right? If I just have like an object given to me, but I can't think it, I can't conceptualize it, I'm not able to reason with it, draw conclusions from it, I'm not even able to judge it and say like, oh, I know something true, or oh, here's a false claim about it, right? Then I haven't taken it up in thinking, and it's in a sense just an occurrence. It's not really knowledge, it's not really cognition. Okay, so we need two things. We need intuitions and we need concepts. And so here is what Kant says. He says, if we will call the receptivity of our mind to receive representations insofar as it is affected in some way sensibility, then on the contrary, the faculty for bringing forth representations itself, or the spontaneity of cognition, is the understanding. It comes along with our nature that intuition can never be other than sensible, that is, that it contains only the way in which we are affected by objects. The faculty for thinking of objects of sensible intuition, on the contrary, is the understanding. Neither of these should be preferred to each other, and then we get thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind. So, on the one hand there's sensibility, on the other hand there's the understanding, and Kant calls sensibility also our faculty for receptivity, for being given something, which is the only way we can get into contact with objects when they are given to us. And he calls the understanding spontaneity. So why spontaneity, right? What is spontaneous about the understanding? Well, Kant tells us that it is a faculty for bringing forth representations itself, right? The understanding is supposed to be active. The understanding is not there waiting to receive something from outside. The understanding is an activity, right? Or it is a faculty that allows us to be active. It does things. It thinks. It brings intuitions under concepts. And it judges, right? It says, oh, this is true, I believe it. Or this is false, I do not believe it. Now, judging is an activity. And maybe one interesting way to see that it's an activity, that it is goal-directed, that it must have some element of freedom in it, right, and thus be spontaneous, is to see that judging is a normative business. It is something that you can do well or that you can do wrong, right? You can do it right or wrong. Unlike receptivity, right? If something is given to me, if I have a certain sense impression, a certain sensation, then I have it, right? And it doesn't make any sense to wonder whether I ought to have that sensation, right? I'm just having it, right? That's just an occurrence. But as soon as I judge, as soon as I say, hey, there is a tree over there, right? That's a judgment. And then immediately it makes sense to ask me, well, is that correct? Are you justified in making that judgment? Are you following the right norms? And then, if I am able to say something like, yeah, sure, I mean, I see it quite clearly. These are totally normal circumstances. I have every reason to believe that there is a tree over there. That's fine. On the other hand, if I say, well, it's really dark, I can't see it all that well, but, well, there's certainly something, right? Then we might conclude that I was too hasty in my judgment. I was too hasty. I shouldn't have judged that there's a tree over there. And if I say, well, I've just been using these psychoactive drugs and I'm seeing Smurfs everywhere, and they're hanging in that singing tree, that's maybe the point where we should say that I'm not justified in my judgment at all, right? That maybe I should judge the opposite, that probably all of this is purely an illusion. So, not sure how often Kant has been explained using the Smurfs, but possibly this was the first time. Also, possibly not. Okay, so that is one reason to think of the understanding as something active. It's an activity, right? It does things, it judges, it can do that rightly or wrongly, it can be justified or unjustified. This is something in which human freedom, in which human spontaneity plays a role. It's not just an occurrence in your mind, it's something that you do and that you can be held responsible for. Now, that is not really the way that Kant is going to explain this term spontaneity. He's not talking about being held responsible or justification, those kinds of terms that are pretty important in contemporary epistemology. But I think it fits his views and his way of thinking about judgment as an activity very well. So, this is the first important thing that Kant is doing here in the introduction to the idea of a transcendental logic. Right? He is telling us there's intuition, there is concepts, you need to bring both of them together. And so sensibility and understanding have always got to come together. Receptivity and spontaneity always have to come together. So, okay, well, given that we know that, what is logic to be? Because the Transcendental Aesthetic was an attempt to understand the a priori contributions of sensibility. And so now, of course, what we want to do is we want to understand the a priori contributions of the understanding. Right? The a priori contributions of the understanding. And that is what logic is all about. Right? Logic is all about analyzing and understanding the understanding. So that is why we are, after the aesthetic, now going to a part of the book called the Transcendental Logic, in which we are going to talk about the understanding and about reason, which is in a sense a sort of it sort of takes up. Reason is where the judgments of the understanding are taken up and linked to each other. So it is something that sort of either encompasses or presupposes the understanding. Kant uses the term sometimes in a narrower and sometimes in a broader sense. Okay, so what is logic to do? It is, Kant tells us at B76, A52, it is the science of the rules of understanding in general. Logic is the science of the rules of understanding in general. Now, he says, logic in turn can be undertaken with two different aims, either as the logic of the general or of the particular use of the understanding. So the general use of the understanding is just thinking in general, and the particular use is thinking in some field, right? So maybe we can have general logic, and then maybe we can have something like the logic of biology, or the logic of chemistry, or the logic of history. I mean, who knows, right? Those would be particular fields in which we use the understanding, and we could have a sort of science for that, right? Think about how we have to use the understanding. What are the rules of the understanding when it comes to doing biology, or when it comes to doing history, or maybe even more narrower fields might have their own rules, and so on and so forth. So Kant tells us that the logic of the particular use of the understanding contains the rules for correctly thinking about a certain kind of object. This can be called elementary logic. The former can be called elementary logic, the general use of the understanding. It's elementary logic. The latter, however, is the organon of this or that science. So what is an organon? Well, it's a term that comes from Aristotle, from Aristotle's logical works. And an organ, right, like our organs in our body, they're sort of tools with a particular function that allow us to do certain things. When Kant thinks of logic as an organon, he's thinking of it as a way to generate more knowledge, right? These are the rules for investigation and getting to new knowledge, to new insights. And so when he talks about the organon of this or that science, he's talking about the rules for conducting investigations in a particular science in order to get more and more knowledge, right? In order to learn new things. That is what a particular logic can be, but Kant says you can really only set this up once such a science is already pretty well advanced, right? One must already know the objects rather well if one will offer the rules for how a science of them is to be brought about. Right? So once we know a lot about biology, or a lot about physics, or a lot about history, that's maybe when we can sort of confidently put together a scientific method, really, for getting more. Right? How should we reason in order to extend our knowledge of these fields? That's what Kant thinks about when he thinks about an organon. Okay, general logic. We can cut up general logic into pure or applied logic, Kant tells us. In the former, we abstract from all empirical conditions under which our understanding is exercised, e.g. from the influence of the senses, from the play of the imagination, the laws of memory, the power of habit, and so on and so forth. So what we do in a pure logic is we abstract from all psychology. Right? We're not interested in human biases. We are not interested in like the limitations of the human mind or the tricks that might allow us to improve the workings of the human mind. That is applied logic. Right? Applied logic is in a sense a kind of useful psychology where we try to help ourselves reason better, maybe be on our guard for certain mistakes. But in pure logic, we are not thinking about that at all. We are only, trying to understand the rules of thought, right? In a sort of abstract way, without being interested in specific human strengths or weaknesses. So a general but pure logic therefore has to do with strictly a priori principles and is a canon of the understanding and reason, but only in regard to what is formal in their use, be the content what it may. So a canon here, a canon, is different from an organon. The way that Kant thinks about this, a canon gives us certain rules that might allow us to see the false and the true in certain circumstances. For instance, general logic could give us something like the law of non-contradiction, right, which says that you can never affirm both A and not A. Right? You can't affirm something and its negation. That's the law of non-contradiction. And if we have that, we can at least see certain falsehoods. Right? If I say something like, the Critique of Pure Reason is a fantastic book and the Critique of Pure Reason is not a fantastic book, then you can say, wait, that is a contradiction, right? This can't be true. Alright, and that's useful, but, and Kant wants us to be very aware of this limitation, this is not an organon. Right? This does not allow us to extend our knowledge. Right? We can't use the principle of non-contradiction, Kant is going to say, in order to find out things that we didn't already know. It is not like some kind of scientific method, some rule for investigation. It is merely this sort of formal insight into truth, into thinking, into the understanding that allows us to put certain things as clearly true and other things as clearly false, but from a purely formal perspective. So that's a canon, and Kant wants us to never make the mistake of thinking that a canon could also at the same time be an organon. Right? A canon is not something that we can use to extend our knowledge. And Kant thinks this is very important, again, because he thinks that a lot of people have made this mistake. And they have thought that the pure laws of logic can be used to extend our knowledge. Right? And Kant is going to tell us that that is impossible. So finally, if a general logic is applied, right, then it concerns the use of the understanding in like this specific human situation, like including our psychology. And so what it can do, well, it can be what Kant calls a cathartic of the common understanding. And here a cathartic is it's like a medical term, right? It's something that you take to get rid of something, to get rid of errors, right? To get rid of biases, to make sure that you don't fall into these traps. So it's useful, a cathartic, but it's like a medicine. It's something that helps us, in a sense, clean up our psychological problems, our logical psychological problems. So it's useful, but it's again very different. And Kant wants us to keep these things very much apart. The organon, the canon, the cathartic. The organon leads us to new knowledge. The canon gives us some formal truths and falsehoods. The cathartic rids us of bad habits of thinking. Okay, so that is the idea of a general logic. Then in section 2, Kant is going to introduce his big innovation, which is the idea of a transcendental logic. A general logic, as Kant has told us, abstracts away from all content, right? It's about the purely formal uses of the understanding. It abstracts away from all content. This is, of course, very different from like a logic of history or a logic of biology, which is about a very specific kind of object, right? It's about a very specific kind of content, and we have to know already a lot about that content, Kant thinks, before we can set up a logic about it. But in Kant's transcendental philosophy, and having just had the aesthetic, we can suddenly see a new kind of logic that might be possible. A logic that is more general than anything that is about a specific object, but at the same time less abstract than a logic that abstracts away from all content. Because what transcendental philosophy is asking after are the conditions under which objects can be cognized by us, right? The conditions under which we can get into touch with objects and think about them and judge about them. And so what we are doing in this sort of transcendental mode is we are not thinking about any particular objects, but we're also not abstracting away from all content. What we are keeping is the idea of being in touch with an object, right? What we are thinking about are the conditions under which cognition of objects is possible. And so, without going as far as to have a logic of a particular type of object, of a particular kind of contentful knowledge, we can think about reasoning about objects, right? Reasoning about what must reasoning be like in order for cognition of objects to be possible for us, right? That's a kind of question that we could be asking in the Kantian scheme. What must our understanding be like, or how must we use our understanding, or what must be the rules in our understanding or posited by our understanding such that cognition of objects becomes possible for us? And that would be the topic of a transcendental logic. So it would be less general than a general logic, because that's about all content, whatever. And here we are interested in something more specific, right? Cognition of objects, of things that are given to us. Okay. But it is still way more abstract than, the logic of thinking about cows or living beings in general, or historical events, and so on and so forth. So, that is what Kant here introduces in this section 2. And he has a nice little note, I think, that I want to read out about the use of the term transcendental. So I think I've probably said this already, but let's say it again, because this is a piece of terminology that we can't get clear enough. He tells us that not every a priori cognition must be called transcendental, but only that by means of which we cognize that and how certain representations, intuitions or concepts, are applied entirely a priori or are possible, that is, the possibility of cognition or its use a priori. And then he tells us that neither space nor any geometrical determination of it a priori is a transcendental representation, but only the cognition that these representations are not of empirical origin at all, and the possibility that they can nevertheless be related a priori to objects of experience can be called transcendental. So, and he ends by saying that the difference between the transcendental and the empirical therefore belongs only to the critique of cognitions, and does not concern their relation to their object. This is like Kant says, the term transcendental is a term used in philosophy when we think about our cognition, right? When we ask the question whether something is a priori or whether it relates to empirically given objects, that is when we are generating transcendental truths. So the truths of geometry are a priori, but they're not transcendental. But the claim that geometry is about the a priori intuition of space, that is a transcendental claim, right? A claim that belongs to transcendental philosophy. And so when we do transcendental logic, right, we are going to make claims about what the understanding must be in order to make this cognition of objects possible. And so it is about the possibility of cognition and about the conditions of possibility of cognition. And so that is going to belong to transcendental philosophy. So that is why there is a part called the Transcendental Logic here in the book. Okay, finally, in section 3 and 4, Kant is going to make a distinction between the analytic and the dialectical. The analytic and dialectic. Okay, so what is that? Well, here's what Kant says. General logic analyzes the entire formal business of the understanding and reason into its elements and presents these as principles of all logical assessment of our cognition. This part of logic can therefore be called an analytic, and is on that very account at least the negative touchstone of truth, since one must before all else examine and evaluate by means of these rules the form of all cognition, before investigating its contents, in order to find out whether with regard to the object it contains positive truth. So what Kant is saying here is basically that, the analytic part of logic, general logic, is, things like the principle of non-contradiction. And if I want to check out some purported body of knowledge, that's where I should start, right? Does it contain contradictions? No, good. Or yes, bad. And then I can go on to look at the real content. Okay. Nevertheless, Kant says, and now I'm a little further on, B85, close to A61. Nevertheless, there is something so seductive in the possession of an apparent art for giving all of our cognitions the form of understanding, even though with regard to their content one may yet be very empty and poor, that this general logic, which is merely a canon for judging, has been used as if it were an organon for the actual production of at least the semblance of objective assertions, and thus in fact it has thereby been misused. Now, general logic as a putative organon is called dialectic. So general logic as a putative organon, so general logic believed to be something that can extend our knowledge, that can lead us to new insights, that has been called dialectic. And as we've already heard, Kant thinks this is a great mistake. Right? Things like the principle of non-contradiction can never extend our knowledge. They can only show that we are like wrong, that we have misused our thinking if we end up in a contradiction, but they can't be used to extend our knowledge. So people who try to do that, who try to use this canon of reason as an organon, they are doing something that they call dialectic, Kant says. But it's wrong, it's an illusion. And so Kant ends this paragraph 3 by saying that he is going to use the term dialectic in a slightly different way. He is going to use the term dialectic as a critique of this mistake. When he talks about dialectic, what he's going to mean, is a critique of this mistake where people use logic as an organon, even though it can only be a canon. And so we actually will have a pretty large part of this book called the Dialectic, in which Kant is going to do precisely that. Okay, that is what Kant is going to explain here in section 4 on the division of transcendental logic into the transcendental analytic and dialectic. So, the part of transcendental logic that expounds the elements of the pure cognition of the understanding and the principles without which no object can be thought at all is the transcendental analytic, and at the same time a logic of truth. So there's going to be a positive, truthful part of transcendental logic, which is the transcendental analytic. And what is it going to do? Well, it is going to think about the conditions of objects being thought by us. And what we're going to see, Kant says, is that there will be some a priori concepts and a priori principles that we know in advance are going to apply to all our cognition of objects. And these are going to generate truths for us, right? Actually contentful truths about all our cognition of objects. This is going to be where Kant is going to prove some of these famous metaphysical claims that he makes, such as that every event has a cause. That is going to happen in the analytic. On the other hand, the understanding falls into the danger of making a material use of the merely formal principles of pure understanding through empty sophistries. When does this happen? This happens when what we find in the analytic, when we consider the conditions under which objects can be thought by us, right? When we use those insights and apply them in situations where no objects are given to us, right? Because we are no longer in the realm of sensibility, so no objects are given to us. If we nevertheless apply the results of the transcendental analytic, such as that every event has a cause, in those situations where objects aren't cognized by us, then we have been led into an illusion. And those illusions are going to be exposed by Kant in the Transcendental Dialectic, which is therefore more or less a negative part of the book. And as you may already know, that's where Kant is going to think about the soul, the world, and God. And he's going to try to show us that we do not know, and could not possibly know, things like the soul is immortal, the world is eternal, God exists. Okay, so that's going to be the dialectic. So this, I think, gives us a pretty good idea of what Kant is going to be up to. And so we can go on to the first division of the Transcendental Logic, which is the Transcendental Analytic. Right? So the positive part, we're going to see what the understanding brings to cognition of objects a priori. And the Transcendental Logic itself is divided into two parts, the first book and the second book. The first book is the Analytic of Concepts, which is going to be about the a priori concepts of the understanding. And then the second book is going to be about the a priori principles of the understanding, sort of the basic truths in which those concepts will figure. So, in our next video, let's make the move to this first book, the Analytic of Concepts.